Hi, everyone. So in this talk, I will discuss the philosophy of gazing at male beauty or Shahid-bazi, Nazar-bazi, or Bache-bazi. The philosophy originated in ancient Greece and penetrated the Muslim world as early as the middle of the ninth century. The followers of the philosophy in the Muslim world base their understanding of it on the popular Hadith al-Ruya, according to which the Prophet saw God in his dream or during the ascension in the form of a beardless youth. In the Muslim tradition, references to God having human form can be found in the teachings of Al-Jabaliri, who notes that although God has human form, he does not have flesh and blood and is like a radiant light, and in the works of Al-Barra, who refers to God's black hair. Some Sufis, such as Tirmizi and Ruzbahan Baqli, even claim to have seen God themselves. Of course, it should be noted that these teachings were subject to orthodox criticism. For instance, Muhammad al-Ghazali tries to refute the anthropomorphic interpretations of these dreams, saying that, quote, what the one asleep sees in a dream is not the form of God, but only a symbol, a likeness. Radiant light and beautiful forms are but likeness of real, not physical beauty, which has no form, end quote. Another group of Sufis called Hululis or Hululiye went even further, teaching that God resides in people or animals. The practice of gazing at the beauty of youths and contemplating divine beauty is believed to have emerged out of the Hululis' ideas and was likewise condemned by Orthodox theologians and also strict Sufis. The practice, however, was maintained in Sufi circles with reference being made not to hulul, but which means incarnation, but to shahid. The Khoda's Lughatnameh defines shahid as witnessing divine beauty perceived through the beauty of a male, and shahid-bazi as the act of falling in love with a beautiful male, which is also synonymous with lavat or sodomy. Some Sufis, such as al-Solami, Firuzabadi, who spoke of Shahid, based their teachings on the sayings of the Prophet, who recommended contemplating beautiful objects. Others, such as Abu Hamza and al-Junaid, are believed to have tried to combat sensuality during their own practices of contemplation, but have found it difficult. The practice of contemplating beautiful objects appears in Iranian philosophical works as well, such as in Farabi's work or in Abu Ali Sina's in the ninth century. In his works discussing the philosophy, Abu Ali Sina condemns gazing the contemplation or gazing at youths and loving them if there is physical attraction and sexual desire involved. However, he approves if it is done for the sake of the union with the ultimate beloved. Among Sufis who condemned gazing at the beauty of the youth were Muhammad al-Ghazali, Qushairi, Hojviri, Sohrawardi, Bahawalad, and al-Jawzi. For instance, al-Qushairi warns against the practice of shahid and rejects the idea that it does no harm to the soul. Hojviri also rejects the practice altogether, announcing that, quote, looking at youths and associating them are forbidden practices, and anyone who declares this to be allowable is an unbeliever, end quote. Likewise, al-Jawzi warns dervishes against loving the sons of kings and writes, quote, don't fill your eyes with the sons of kings, for they represent a temptation which is worse than the temptation of maidens, end quote. The fact that all these theologians and Sufis felt the need to warn the society against contemplating the beauty of this youth makes us question whether the practice was exclusively intended for divine contemplation or it did, in fact, cross the boundaries of spirituality and enter the realm of sensuality. Ideally, the practice was expected to be confined to spirituality without any accompanying feelings of physical attraction or sexual encounters. It was also supposed to be discreet and unexposed to the public eye and not reciprocated easily and publicly by the beloved. There were many warnings against the dangers of gazing at the beauty of adolescent boys because it was regarded to be potential prelude to getting involved in a sexual encounter and thus committing one of the most important and major sins in Islam, lavot, to be, which is considered to be a transgression against haqq Allah, a right of God. Another reason for these warnings was the potential for Shahid-bazi to disrupt the traditional gender roles. Like many other cultures, Islamic culture had also developed its own understanding of gender roles for the opposite sexes, where women were expected to be timid and passive, and men were expected to be aggressive and active. Now, these features demarcated the boundaries between the male and female spheres, the crossing of which would be a transgression. Since gazing at the beauty of adolescent boys could have led to sexual consummation, one partner would have been active and the other one passive. The passive partner would have therefore been subject to derision because they would have crossed the gender boundaries by allowing themselves to be emasculated and feminized. So these were some of the reasons for the condemnations. In addition to medieval scholars, however, several modern scholars have also discussed this ancient Greco and Arabo-Muslim cultural practice, which appears very different from to be very different from our modern understanding of same-sex relationships and homosexuality. These scholars have actually asserted that homosexuality is not an appropriate term to define the experience of a male taking pleasure in relationships with adolescent boys. Now, beginning from where it originated, in the history of sexuality, Michel Foucault notes that for the ancient Greeks, and I'm quoting, love for one's own sex and love for the opposite sex were not mutually exclusive emotions. The boundaries were not drawn based on the sex of the beloved or the lover, but on their ethical viewpoints. According to ancient Greek thought, being inclined toward men or women represented, quote, the appetite that nature had implemented in man's heart for beautiful human beings, end quote, whatever their sex. Now, the notion of two different desires assigned to different individuals did not exist in ancient Greek society. Both desires could coexist within the same person without being at odds with one another. It was considered merely a different way of taking pleasure and, quote, more suited to certain individuals or certain periods of existence, end quote. Thus, enjoying both adolescent boys and women was not inherently contradictory. A man who preferred adolescent boys to females was not considered naturally or socially different from those who were inclined to women. In that sense, in this culture, there was no socially imposed distinction between the two types of love. The preference for adolescent boys seemed not more a matter of taste than an inherent persuasion. In the same context, Janet Afari also writes that in pre-modern Iranian society, men were not necessarily identified by their sexual desires, but rather by their positionality in sexual relationship, that is, being passive or active, which is also conforming to the gender role understanding, which I discussed earlier. Now, same-sex relationships between an adult man and an adolescent boy, as long as they were implicit and discreet, they were accepted or tolerated cultural practices in Mediterranean Muslim societies. Regardless of the fact that this type of love was widely practiced and tolerated, it was subject to numerous complications. Therefore, the practice was inhibited by various rules and disciplines that had to be followed and decoded. For example, the first thing to be taken into consideration was the difference in age and status between the lover and the beloved. A relationship between two men of the same status or age would result in the assumption of the passivity on one's behalf. And since adult male passivity was abhorred, the adult who submitted passively or to passivity would become a subject of derision. Now, despite these rules about age and status difference, it would be wrong to assume that all same-sex desires or relationships were limited to adult men and adolescent boys. The same kind of relationship could have been formed between two men of the same age and status or two young boys. One other imposed rule in ancient Greece was the ritual of courtship. To make a relationship a culturally and morally overloaded domain, there was a complex set of appropriate behaviors to be followed. The purpose was to endow the relationship with a beautiful form which would be aesthetically acceptable as well. And the roles of the partners in the process of the courtship were of utmost significance too. The lover had certain rights and obligations. In return, the beloved was expected not to submit easily and to remain coy, but show gratitude. Although the relationship itself was expected to be kept discreet, the ritual of this adult male courting and pursuing an adolescent boy was practiced freely in public spaces such as in gymnasiums or in coffee tea houses. It would continue up until a certain age, but upon the appearance of the first signs of manhood in the young boy, such as the first beard or mustache, or as it is in Persian poetry, khat, it was no longer appropriate for the adolescents to be the object of the adult man's desire. Now, it appears that the love of the adolescent boys was not initially forbidden, and nothing prohibited adult men from being in an open and free association and relationship with adolescent boys. And these young boys were objects of adult men's desire and could be their recognized sexual partners as well. However, over time, the love for the adolescent boys' beauty gradually transformed into a love directed to the soul of the boy rather than to the body. And this began with Plato, who established the inferiority of love of an adolescent boy's body as opposed to the love of their soul. And the soul that had not yielded was highly praised. The beauty of the soul was ultimately expected to make an individual gaze upon the vast ocean of beauty. Now, Plato structured the quote, love relation as a relation to truth by placing it in the one who is loved as well as in the one who is in love, and by reversing the roles of the loved young man, making him a lover of a master of truth. In this way, Platonic erotics made the topic of truth, which is with capital T, meaning the divine, a pivotal element into this type of relationship. Consequently, men and women became objects of divine contemplation. However, since the presence of women in Sufi lodges would create uproar and chaos in society, Sufis often prefer to choose young men, such as pretty young slaves or disciples, as their as ideal of beauty and objects of divine contemplation. Now, the Sufis were expected to admire the beauty of these young boys, which would lead them to that Platonic truth. However, as I mentioned earlier, this was just the ideal, and the um, practice was found to be very difficult. And regarding this discrepancy between the ideal and the actual practice and the resultant scene, Afsan and Ajmabadi also writes that the desire aroused by beauty, quote, was not considered improper or sinful in itself. Sin belonged to the domain of the deeds, for which reason there is plenty of literature warning against practices that might prompt a believer to engage in sinful acts, end quote. Therefore, it is the sinful acts and deeds following the gaze that were to be disciplined, and reason for many warnings and advisories to control one's desire and gaze, and not the contemplation itself. The emergence of the philosophy in Iran resulted in two different kinds of same-sex relations. One appeared as a result of the philosophy which I just discussed. The other one emerged with the arrival of a large contingent of enslaved Turkish-speaking men and women who were to be used both in the army and for domestic purposes. Cyrus Shamisa refers to this philosophy or this relationship as Shahid-bazi, Nazar-bazi, Lawat, and Bache-bazi as interchangeable terms used for the philosophy of gazing at the beauty of the adolescent boys. The Ghaznavid Empire favored these Turkish slaves, and Lawat was a common practice in that period. Zarinkub mentions that one of the characteristic features of Iranian society from the Samanid period to the Ghaznavid one was the presence of a great number of Turkish slaves in Persian army who were brought either as prisoners of wars or presents for the rulers, and they were promoted in the army quickly, often to the ranks of commanders, and considered very close companions to the rulers. The youth and availability of these Turks made them highly demanded on the slave market, but also a good topic for poetry of the period. And that is why we have the term Turk or Tork, such as in Hafez's Turk-Shirazi, as a synonym for the beloved or Shahid in Persian literature and poetry of the time. Classical Persian literature from the 12th to the 15th century is imbued with themes of same-sex relations and homoerotic allusions and symbolism. Persian Sufi poetry overflows with rituals of courtship between people of more or less equal status, such as the master-disciple relationship in Sufi orders within the convent. And the poems disclose the sexual inclination of the poet at times. However, they are mostly the poet's conformity to the general trend of the time. Hence, falling in love hopelessly with an adolescent boy became a familiar trope in Sufi literature. Now, a body of literature in Europe with similar themes and topics and motifs also survived from high Middle Ages. Although due to religious prudery of subsequent generations, much of this information has been lost. In 11th and 12th century Europe, there emerged a trend of same-sex desire similar to the one that unfolded in the medieval Muslim world, particularly among clerics and high-ranking churchmen. As a result, a body of literature has also remained. There are striking similarities between the European and the Middle Eastern counterparts literatures in terms of the themes and motifs that are being used. For instance, at the center of the philosophy of Shahid-bazi lies the beautiful beardless adolescent boy that reminds us of all the paintings and portrayals of medieval period of Jesus Christ, which depict the ancient ideal of beauty. Another striking point is that in both classical um, Islamic Sufi poetry and Christian literatures of the medieval era, the subject of same sex desire appeared in the works of men of God or spirituality. Viewing the literature and art of the medieval Europe, we notice frequent references to same sex desire between men. For example, Marie de France writes that in the 12th century, if a man ignored a woman's sexual advances, he would have been labeled as a sodomite. Or Jacques de Vitry's the description of the Parisian students in the same era is another portrayal of that line of thinking. And he also writes about the clerics, and he says that that fornication was not considered a sin, and prostitutes would drag the clerics to brothels by force and very publicly. And if clerics refused to enter the brothels, they would have been labeled as sodomites. And this labeling was so prevalent in the city that it was a high honor for a man at the time to keep actually several concubines. Now, Roman society was, to an extent, tolerant and accepting of same sex relations and did not regard them as threatening, harmful, or immoral. Neither the law nor the religious text or religion regarded these relationships as different from heterosexuality. As it is with Greek and Mediterranean societies, Roman society assumed that adult males could have sexual relations with both sexes. Thus, same sex acts were not illegal. In Augustan Rome, the government taxed prostitutes who entered same sex relations and granted legal holidays to boy prostitutes. Authors who objected to same sex relations regarded it as shameful or dishonorable, but not illegal. Of course, this is not to say that there were no sexual taboos during this time, but that they were not directed at same sex relations. In fact, as it was in other cultures as well, the passive partner in the relationship, if adult and a citizen, was subject to strong derision, whereas a non-citizen and young boys could be passive partners without loss of status if the relationship was voluntary and consensual. Similar to most cultures, gender-related concepts of behavior depended on cultural variables. However, writings on same-sex relations became rare after the 3rd century, beginning with the rise of legal actions against them. The literature surviving from the 12th century depicts Christian writings celebrating personal affection, which transcends all moral, social, or familial obligations. This in itself is evidence of the dramatic social change of the time in European society. The literature is also full of references to mutual love, affection, and transformation. Love transformed the asceticism of the desert fathers to the passionate mysticism of, for example, Saint Bernard. This sublimation of love was in fact accompanied by the development of the veneration of humanism in social matters and a respect for personal freedom, values, and feelings. These social shifts promoted public tolerance of all minorities that left long-standing effects on cultural values and literature. Out of the High Middle Ages, a body of literature depicting same-sex desire and love survived, although due to ignorance, much of the information on the subject, as I mentioned, has been lost. For example, in many literary works in medieval period, for instance, in Ovid's Art of Love, you will find this phrase, "A boy's love appealed to me less," changed to "A boy's love appealed to me not at all," in order to show that Ovid was not a sodomite. Another body of same-sex literature has also survived from the 11th and 12th centuries that deals mostly with religious themes of an orthodox nature regarding love. Many of the authors of these poems were prominent churchmen with significant authority. However, none of them were accused of unorthodoxy. 12th century Europe saw a novelty in the overt expression of the bishops and priests about same-sex desire and relationships. Earlier medieval poets had also referred to similar topics in their writings, but they were less overt. The use of erotic language and themes referring to same-sex desire by high-ranking religious officials who simultaneously wrote on conventional topics was a new social development. One of the most important and prominent topoi of the period was the emergence and adoration of this figure called Ganymede, which meant the beautiful son of the king of Troy, whom Jove had carried away to be his cupbearer in heaven. The term became synonymous with the beloved in same-sex relationships in high Middle Ages. Other terms that were frequently used to refer to same-sex relations, youthfulness, and intimacy were boy game or game of love, and language of war, and any language related to hunting. For example, a cleric was referred to as a beautiful boy and a monk as a little boy. Marbode of Rennes' position made his attitude towards same-sex desire very influential in Europe, and his manuscripts were circulated all over Europe. Using mostly religious themes, Marbode includes verses in his poem titled "The Unyielding Boy" that satirize an unyielding boy. The reference to an unyielding boy is, of course, a reminder of the courtship rituals of Sufi philosophy of Shahid-bazi, where the adolescent boy is expected to be coy and not surrender easily. Marbode's language in his poem has both sexual and romantic overtones. For example, take this line: "Who by the viciousness of his character denies the beauty of his body?" The unyielding, unattainable love object is a recurrent theme in his works. The theme of an unyielding young boy can also be found in the works of a student of Peter Abelard, Hilary the Englishman. Hilary refers to the arrogance of this young English boy in his poetry and complains about it. Hilary's poetry is very personal in the way that he expresses his anxiety over his feelings for this youth and his commitments to a woman at the same time. However, when Hilary's poems are addressed to the woman, they lack the emotional intensity of those addressed to the young man. Hilary also makes use of the metaphor of hunting and the language of hunter and hunted, and refers to himself as the hunted, a reference to his helplessness in the face of this unyielding beloved. These metaphors of the game of love, the language of war, the language of hunting are also used in Sufi poetry. After the 12th century, because of this body of literature, the existence of men who had desire both for men and for women became common knowledge in Europe. As in Middle Eastern cultures, this desire was not considered a fixed sexual orientation in medieval Europe either.